The winter of 1942–43 left scars across the Eastern Front that would not heal. Snow melted into mud, and the endless plains of southern Russia seemed to stretch forever, marked only by the wreckage of frozen tanks and shattered villages. The Red Army, now hardened by Stalingrad, pressed its advantage, rebuilding its strength while the Germans struggled to recover. Hitler's forces were exhausted, yet the Führer remained convinced that a decisive victory could still be achieved. The German generals, aware of the growing disparity, feared the coming battles. The Wehrmacht, once a machine of lightning conquest, now faced a foe that had learned from every mistake, a nation whose endurance was nearly limitless. By early 1943, the strategic focus shifted toward the Kursk salient, a massive bulge in the Soviet lines. Hitler believed that destroying it would restore initiative in the east. The Germans gathered hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. Operation Citadel, as it was called, was meant to encircle and annihilate the Soviet forces within the salient, crushing any hope of Soviet counterattack. The Germans underestimated the Red Army's preparation. Stalin, fully aware of the German intent, had ordered the construction of an intricate defensive network stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Trenches layered 3 deep, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, fortified villages, and artillery emplacements created a fortress across the steppe. Every meter of the line was designed to bleed the attackers, slow them, and force them into killing zones. When the offensive began on July 5, 1943, the German assault hit like a thunderclap. Panzer divisions surged forward, supported by waves of Luftwaffe bombers that rained destruction on Soviet positions. Yet the German advance was slow, measured in meters rather than kilometers. Every tank knocked out by hidden anti-tank guns, every infantry unit shredded by artillery, forced a halt. The Soviets allowed the Germans to advance into prepared kill zones, where ambushes awaited. In the forests and hedgerows, infantry and tanks clashed in brutal, grinding combat. The Kursk battle was not a war of movement but a war of attrition, a test of endurance, skill, and will. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies at first, but Soviet pilots, flying Tu-34 tank support missions and light fighters, gradually gained control in key sectors. Dogfights raged overhead, with planes spiraling down in flames, their pilots trapped in the endless cycle of death. Soviet anti-aircraft artillery shredded German bombers, limiting their effectiveness. On the ground, the Red Army fought with relentless discipline. Newly trained troops replaced the casualties without pause. Reserves from the east and Siberia flooded into the salient, making the Soviet defense nearly impregnable. The Wehrmacht, despite superior tactics and armored strength, faced an enemy prepared for every eventuality. For days, the battle remained static. The German forces could not achieve a decisive breakthrough. Tanks bogged down in mud and craters, infantry lost in a labyrinth of trenches and fortifications. Every village captured was fought for house by house, often reduced to rubble in the process. Casualties mounted on both sides. By mid-July, Hitler realized that victory at Kursk would not come quickly. He postponed further assaults, calling for more reinforcements. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders, confident in their preparations, launched counteroffensives along the flanks, catching the German advance in the first stages of encirclement. As July turned to August, the tide shifted. Soviet artillery, massed in overwhelming concentrations, pounded German positions. Soviet tanks, deployed in deep reserves, struck the flanks of overstretched panzer divisions, destroying vehicles and isolating infantry units. German communications faltered, supply lines snapped under constant attack, and the advancing columns lost coordination. For the first time since the invasion began, the Wehrmacht faced defeat in open battle, a humiliation that reverberated across the Reich. The Battle of Kursk had turned into a catastrophe for Hitler. The myth of the unstoppable German armored spear had shattered, replaced by the reality of a resilient, well-prepared Soviet war machine. While Kursk raged, the Germans in the south struggled to maintain their hold on the Cuban region and the Caucasus oil fields. Army Group A, stretched along 1,000 kilometers of mountain passes, faced logistical nightmares. Supply convoys became easy targets for Soviet partisans, who operated in forests and swamps, sabotaging roads, railways, and fuel depots. German units, isolated and undersupplied, struggled to survive. Soldiers suffered from heat, exhaustion, and hunger, yet Hitler's orders forbade withdrawal. The front began to collapse in slow motion, as attrition consumed both men and material. By late August 1943, Kursk had concluded. The Soviets had regained the strategic initiative. German forces were retreating across the steppe, the once vaunted panzer divisions worn down, their strength irrecoverable. The Red Army pursued relentlessly, recapturing towns, villages, and industrial centers. Cities such as Belgrade, Kharkov, and Oral returned to Soviet hands, their liberation a symbolic and practical blow to German hopes. The Wehrmacht, weakened and demoralized, could no longer dictate the terms of engagement. The Eastern Front had shifted irreversibly. The offensive had failed, and the Germans were now on the defensive for the first time since the start of Barbarossa. In the following months, the Red Army pressed south and west, slowly pushing the Germans toward the Dnieper River and the Black Sea. Every inch of territory was contested. Villages were destroyed, farmland scorched, rivers crossed under artillery fire. Soviet partisans behind German lines sabotaged railways and ambushed supply convoys, spreading chaos in the rear. The German army, already weakened, faced constant harassment, compounding its retreat. Meanwhile, the Soviet war machine roared forward. Factories east of the Urals continued to produce tanks, artillery, and aircraft in unprecedented numbers, outpacing the Germans and providing the material basis for the final push into Eastern Europe. By the end of 1943, the Germans had lost nearly all of their gains from the previous year. The Red Army had liberated vast swaths of Ukraine, the Crimea, and Belarus. Cities once under German occupation were rebuilt or transformed into fortresses for further resistance. The psychological impact on both sides was immense. German soldiers, once confident in their invincibility, were now haunted by the knowledge that the enemy could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. Soviet troops, hardened by years of suffering, fought with renewed resolve, determined to push to the heart of Germany itself. Winter returned in 1943–44, but the Germans were no longer on the offensive. They were retreating across snow and ice, trying to maintain a coherent defensive line along the Dnieper and in the Baltic regions. Soviet offensives were relentless. Cities such as Smolensk, Kiev, and Novgorod were liberated. Millions of civilians, long oppressed under Nazi occupation, greeted the Red Army as liberators, though they also witnessed the immense destruction left behind by retreating forces. Every German withdrawal became a small catastrophe. Scorched fields, destroyed bridges, and fleeing refugees created chaos that slowed both armies but harmed the Germans most severely. The spring of 1944 saw the Soviet forces launch massive summer offensives across Ukraine and Belarus, rolling up German positions in waves. The Wehrmacht was stretched to the breaking point. In places like the Kamenets-Podilsky pocket, entire German corps were nearly destroyed or forced to escape under desperate conditions. Losses of equipment were catastrophic. For every tank destroyed, German replacements were inadequate. Supply lines were constantly harassed by partisan activity and artillery strikes. The front was crumbling. Hitler still insisted on holding every position, issuing orders that defied reality. German divisions were trapped in encirclements, forced to fight without hope of relief, yet they obeyed the orders, demonstrating discipline even in the face of annihilation. By mid-1944, the Red Army had reached the borders of Poland and the Baltic states. The Germans were now fighting on their own territory, a defensive war in which every town, river, and forest became a battlefield. Soviet forces, now confident in their logistical superiority, massed artillery and armor for massive offensives that would crush German defenses. The speed and coordination of Soviet attacks left the Wehrmacht reeling. Cities such as Lvov, Vilnius, and Riga fell rapidly. German soldiers began to understand that the war could not be won, that the Eastern Front had become a slow, inexorable march toward Berlin. As the summer of 1944 ended, Soviet offensives spread across the Balkans, liberating Romania, Bulgaria, and parts of Hungary. The Germans tried to stabilize the front along the Carpathian Mountains, but they were too few and too exhausted. Soviet forces moved in coordinated thrusts, using tanks, artillery, and air support to collapse the German positions systematically. Each advance cut off German units, forcing surrender or annihilation. Hitler's promises of ultimate victory rang hollow as the Reich's defenses crumbled. As 1944 turned to 1945, the Germans found themselves in retreat across all sectors of the Eastern Front. The Soviet juggernaut pushed relentlessly westward, advancing through Poland, the Baltics, and Hungary. Cities that had been under Nazi control for years were liberated, often amidst ruined infrastructure and devastated populations. Soviet forces combined overwhelming firepower with meticulous planning, encircling German armies, forcing surrender, and cutting supply lines. Entire German divisions were annihilated or captured, and the Wehrmacht could no longer establish coherent defensive lines. Morale plummeted. Soldiers who had once believed in rapid victories now faced a relentless foe who replaced losses almost instantly. Every day, the Germans lost ground, men, and hope. By January 1945, Soviet armies were poised to enter eastern Germany. The Vistula-Oder offensive swept across Poland, capturing Warsaw and Krakow with astonishing speed. German units, exhausted and depleted, collapsed under the combined pressure of armored spearheads, artillery barrages, and infantry assaults. Refugees fled westward in massive columns, clogging roads and railways, their lives uprooted by the war's final stages. The Germans, increasingly unable to reinforce or supply their front lines, watched as their homeland was invaded. The Eastern Front had become a rolling catastrophe, with Soviet forces approaching Berlin itself. As winter thawed, the Soviets launched the Upper Silesian offensive, further weakening German positions in southern Poland and Silesia. Strategic cities, factories, and rail hubs fell quickly, denying the Germans the ability to regroup. In East Prussia, German forces fought with desperation, but the Soviet advance was overwhelming. The Red Army's logistics, bolstered by years of production east of the Urals, allowed for continuous supply and reinforcement, while the Germans faced dwindling reserves, collapsing transportation networks, and relentless partisan activity behind the lines. The German High Command was in disarray, issuing contradictory orders, often ignored by field commanders who recognized the futility of resistance. In March 1945, the Soviets crossed the Oder River, bringing them within striking distance of Berlin. Every kilometer westward was soaked in blood, every town a battlefield. German defenses were improvised, utilizing hastily constructed fortifications, civilians pressed into service, and remnants of veteran units. Despite this, Soviet firepower was overwhelming. Artillery barrages destroyed streets and buildings before infantry moved in. Tanks advanced through rubble and ruins, crushing whatever resistance remained. The German army, once capable of lightning campaigns, now staggered under the sheer weight of the Soviet advance. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler and the Nazi leadership prepared for the end. The city became a fortress, every street barricaded, every building converted into defensive positions. Civilians were conscripted to dig trenches, move ammunition, and support the war effort. Yet even in this final stronghold, the inevitability of defeat loomed. Soviet forces, under Marshals Zhukov and Komov, encircled the city in April 1945. The Germans fought fiercely, but the Soviet numerical and material superiority was decisive. Air and artillery strikes flattened buildings, leaving the city a landscape of smoke and fire. German soldiers fought street by street, often reduced to desperate combat in basements, sewers, and ruined buildings. The fall of Berlin was both brutal and symbolic. By late April, Soviet forces had closed in on the Reich Chancellery, the heart of Nazi power. Hitler, isolated and refusing to flee, prepared for the inevitable. Within the city, chaos reigned, officers ignored orders, soldiers surrendered, and civilians hid amid ruins. On April 30, 1945, Hitler committed suicide, signaling the collapse of Nazi leadership. The remnants of the German army surrendered or were destroyed in the days that followed. Berlin, once a symbol of imperial power and ideological dominance, lay in smoldering ruins, its streets littered with corpses and debris. The surrender of Germany followed swiftly. On May 7, 1945, the German High Command signed the unconditional surrender in Reims, France. Fighting ceased across the Eastern Front, ending nearly 4 years of unprecedented violence. The human toll was staggering: millions of soldiers and civilians dead, entire cities destroyed, and a continent reshaped by war and occupation. The legacy of Operation Barbarossa was clear. It had begun with the German vision of lightning conquest and ended in total defeat, a strategic disaster that destroyed the Wehrmacht, shattered German morale, and turned the tide irrevocably in favor of the Allies. The Eastern Front had become the crucible in which the fate of Europe was decided. From the initial invasion in June 1941, through the blood-soaked campaigns of Stalingrad, Kursk, and beyond, the human cost had been incalculable. The Soviet Union, despite staggering losses, had endured and emerged victorious, its armies hardened, its industry intact, and its population determined to resist. The Germans, once seemingly unstoppable, were humbled by the resilience of their enemy, by the vastness of the land, and by the unforgiving nature of total war. Cities such as Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin became symbols of sacrifice, endurance, and transformation. The soldiers who survived carried the memory of unimaginable suffering, and civilians bore the scars of occupation and conflict. The landscape itself, from frozen steppe to urban ruin, testified to the scale of destruction. Yet amid the ruin, the foundations of a new Europe began to emerge, shaped by the victors of the conflict and the memory of those who had perished. Operation Barbarossa, conceived as a campaign of rapid conquest, had ultimately failed to achieve its goals. Instead, it became the opening act of Germany's undoing, demonstrating the limits of ambition and the cost of underestimating an opponent prepared for total resistance. The campaign set the stage for the final Allied victories in Europe, the occupation of Germany, and the post-war division of the continent. Its lessons endured: logistical overreach, underestimation of the enemy, and the consequences of ideology-driven military planning could destroy even the most formidable army. In the years after the war, historians would study the Eastern Front as the largest and most brutal theater in human history. Millions of lives lost, entire cities destroyed, armies annihilated, and economies shattered, yet the narrative of endurance and eventual triumph for the Soviet Union became central to understanding the outcome of World War II. The German army, despite skill, bravery, and discipline, had been defeated not just by military force but by geography, climate, and the extraordinary resilience of its opponent. The soldiers who survived carried their experiences into memory, letters, and diaries. They recounted frozen nights, the roar of artillery, the suffocating dust of destroyed cities, and the relentless advance of a foe who seemed inexhaustible. Civilians remembered forced labor, starvation, air raids, and the sudden liberation as armies surged past them. The war left an indelible mark on culture, politics, and society. The boundaries of nations were redrawn, populations displaced, an entire generation shaped by the horrors they had endured. The final lesson of Operation Barbarossa was the human capacity for both destruction and endurance. From the fields of Ukraine to the streets of Berlin, From the frozen forests of Russia to the smoldering ruins of industrial cities, every action had consequences. Every decision, from the highest command to the foot soldier in the mud, contributed to the unfolding catastrophe. The scale of the conflict made individual heroism and tragedy inseparable, woven into the vast tapestry of war. As Europe rebuilt, the memory of the Eastern Front remained a stark warning. The ambition that drove Germany eastward had unleashed unimaginable suffering, but the resilience of the Soviet Union and the determination of its people had reversed the tide. Operation Barbarossa, intended as a lightning strike to end the Soviet state, had instead begun a slow, inexorable process that led to the defeat of Nazi Germany itself. The campaign's end marked the beginning of the post-war order, shaped by victory, loss, and the hard-won lessons of the largest military conflict in human history. In the silence after the guns fell quiet, the devastated landscapes of the East told their story. Burned villages, abandoned tanks, shattered railways, and cemeteries stretching for miles became monuments to the unimaginable scale of human suffering. Survivors, both soldier and civilian, rebuilt cities, farms, and lives amid the ruins. The knowledge that the war had changed the world permanently weighed heavily on everyone. Europe, scarred but alive, had survived, and the shadow of Operation Barbarossa would forever remind humanity of both the depths of destruction and the strength of endurance. By the spring of 1945, the Eastern Front was no longer a battlefield but a testament. The rivers, forests, and cities bore silent witness to the enormity of the conflict. Generations would study maps, diaries, and photographs, attempting to understand the full scope of what had transpired. Operation Barbarossa, from its ambitious inception to its catastrophic failure, had defined the war in the East. The front line that had once stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea now lay broken, yet the story of survival, resistance, and ultimate victory endured. The Soviet Union emerged from the ashes, having suffered enormous losses but having turned the tide of history. Germany, once the aggressor, faced occupation, division, and the consequences of hubris and ideology. Operation Barbarossa was a warning of ambition unchecked by strategy, of logistical overreach, and of underestimating both the land and the people one seeks to conquer. Its legacy would be studied, remembered, and commemorated for generations, a testament to the vastness of human courage, suffering, and endurance on the largest battlefield in history. The Eastern Front, with all its horrors and heroism, concluded as the Soviet armies pressed toward Berlin, the Reich collapsed, and a new Europe began to emerge. From the first invasion in 1941 to the final surrender in 1945, the story of Operation Barbarossa had spanned 4 years of relentless combat, testing the limits of human endurance, the strength of nations, and the nature of modern warfare itself. In the end, it was a chronicle not of swift conquest but of an unyielding struggle, where determination, resilience, and industrial might overcame ambition, ideology, and hubris. The war on the Eastern Front had ended, leaving a world forever changed. Cities rebuilt, borders redrawn, nations scarred. Yet in memory and history, the saga of Operation Barbarossa remained a powerful testament to both the tragedy and the triumph of human resolve.